A small mountain town ruled by fear, a petty HOA enforcer with a clipboard, and one man who wouldn't back down. What happens when the rules are broken and a community fights back? In Silverpine Ridge, one act of defiance sparked a viral battle that shook a whole town. Watch how Karen's quest for control turned into her biggest downfall. A tractor in a front yard, a neighborhood overrun by rules, and a single, unstoppable neighbor determined to reclaim his freedom. This is the story of Silverpine Ridge's greatest comeback. Let's begin the story. It was the middle of a blazing July afternoon when the peace of Silverpine Ridge shattered like glass. The ear-splitting screech of golf cart tires on gravel made me flinch under my welding mask. Sweat poured down my face as I yanked the mask up just in time to see her Kern rocketing toward my property line like a rabid soap opera villain late for a custody hearing. Karen was armed for HOA warfare, a laminated clipboard swinging on a lanyard, a neon orange whistle bobbing around her neck, and a fanny pack so stuffed with paperwork it looked like it could detonate at any second. Before I could even set down my welding torch, she was already at my weathered wooden fence, her face glowing redder than the coals in a blacksmith's forge. "You have exactly 24 hours to remove that monstrosity," she screeched, jabbing her pen at the battered but dearly loved flatbed truck parked proudly in my front yard. Behind her, the usual tag-alongs Pamela and Brett, her faithful minions, shivered awkwardly, clutching overpriced iced coffees and pretending they weren't about to melt in the brutal mountain heat. It would have been laughable if it wasn't so jaw-droppingly stupid. Because the eyesore Karen was shrieking about wasn't just some abandoned heap of rust. It was the chassis for the governor's annual Founders Day Parade float, a top-secret project entrusted to me, Wyatt McCall, by the state itself. I calmly wiped my greasy hands on a rag as Karen puffed herself up like a rooster about to throw down. She didn't ask. She didn't reason. She commanded as if the entire mountain, lake, and sky bent to the almighty will of her clipboard. "This is a violation of Silverpine Ridge HOA bylaws, Section 9.3, she barked, her voice shrill enough to make the crows in the pines squawk in protest. "All construction machinery must be concealed from street view. Consider this your first and final warning." She said it with the smug, righteous tone of someone who thought Facebook groups and reality TV courtroom shows were substitutes for real law. I kept my mouth shut, letting the silence stretch out painfully, watching her dig her own grave with every arrogant word. A slow, dangerous smile tugged at the corner of my mouth. 2 months ago, the State Parade Committee had shown up on my doorstep, desperate. They'd heard about the intricate Veterans Memorial I'd built for the Silverpine Lake VFW last winter. They needed me to build a float that would pay tribute to first responders, complete with a working waterfall feature and a rising eagle sculpture. The catch, it had to be done in secret. No contractors, no leaks, and definitely no nosy hoe ladies with whistle fetishes. One agreed in one condition: I work on my land, undisturbed. And now, here Karen was, obliviously setting the fuse on a bomb she couldn't even see. She thought she was fighting an aesthetic battle over a truck. She was actually on the verge of igniting a political scandal that could blow up bigger than anything Silverpine Ridge had ever seen. And me. I was about to let her walk straight into it. Karen stood at the fence, tapping her clipboard against the wooden slats with a sharp, repetitive crack, like a countdown to some imagined victory. I could see it all playing out behind those furious eyes. She believed she had cornered me, and it was only a matter of time before I crumbled under the weight of her authority. I walked toward her slowly, wiping the last of the welding grime from my hands, letting the tension thicken between us like the dense mountain air before a thunderstorm. My old hound Rufus barked lazily from the porch, sensing the crackling electricity between predator and prey. Though Karen had no idea she was the prey here. "Karen," I said evenly, voice low enough that the wind almost swallowed it, "you really don't want to mess with this." For a flicker of a moment, doubt flashed in her eyes. A normal person might have paused, might have asked a question, might have wondered why someone who had never caused a single stir in this sleepy mountain community was now standing so still, so calm, when faced with her hurricane of demands. But Karen wasn't normal. Karen was a zealot armed with a clipboard and a Facebook group. She barked a laugh, high-pitched and ugly. "Oh, don't you dare play the victim card. The rules apply to everyone, Mr. McCall. Your little farm project isn't special. It's an eyesore, an embarrassment to the Ridge, and if you don't comply..." She snapped her fingers in the air, inches from my face. I'll escalate this to the whole board, the city zoning office, and if I have to, even the mayor's office in Silverpine. Behind her, Pamela shuffled awkwardly, muttering something about tennis lessons, clearly regretting ever agreeing to Karen's crusade. Brett, meanwhile, tried to sip his latte without meeting my eyes. I said nothing. I simply stepped aside, letting Karen's rant echo across the gravel lot and fade into the distant pine trees. Let her feel like she'd won. Let her leave here brimming with self-righteous fury. Every word she spat was another piece of evidence, another nail in her own coffin. Because what she didn't know was that the truck chipped paint, battered tires, and all was now officially classified as state property. It was protected under a state emergency executive order regarding critical community event infrastructure. And tampering with it wasn't a violation of some petty HOA bylaw. It was a felony. A real one. The kind that comes with handcuffs, courtrooms, and televised perp walks. Karen, of course, didn't care. She stabbed a fluorescent pink final warning sticker onto my front gate like she was delivering holy judgment from Mount Olympus. Then she stormed back to her golf cart, revved the tiny engine like she was fleeing a war zone, and kicked up a cloud of dust that coated her followers and her precious clipboard alike. As the dust settled, I stood there alone, heart pounding not from fear, but from a wild, electric anticipation. I knew what was coming next. Karen had drawn the battle lines in the dirt, and she had no idea she was charging straight into a war she couldn't possibly win. That night, Silverpine Ridge sat under a bruised, purple sky, the air so still it felt unnatural. I double-checked the locks on my gates, powered on the security floodlights, and reviewed my cameras one last time. Call it a hunch or maybe just experience, but I knew Karen wasn't the type to wait 24 hours when she could cause trouble immediately. Sure enough, just after midnight, when even the coyotes were too hot to howl, my motion sensors triggered a silent alarm on my phone. I slipped out of bed, heart hammering, and pulled up the live feed. There she was. Karen, bathed in harsh white security light, creeping across the gravel like a burglar in a bad soap opera. And she wasn't alone. Pamela and Brett shuffled behind her like reluctant foot soldiers, glancing around nervously, the whites of their eyes flashing every time a distant dog barked. Karen wore a black hoodie like some ridiculous commando, but the neon pink shoelaces on her sneakers betrayed her in the dark. In her hands, she clutched a fresh violation sticker big, ugly, and bright enough to light up the next county. I watched, jaw tight, as she stomped up to the float chassis so-called eyesore and began her desecration. She slapped the sticker across the windshield so hard it nearly tore. She hurled handfuls of mud onto the body, the doors, even into the exposed engine compartment. Pamela hesitated, muttering something I couldn't quite catch on the microphone feed, but Karen barked at her like a drill sergeant until she half-heartedly kicked some gravel against the tires. Britt stood off to the side, filming the whole disaster on his phone, as if collecting evidence of their own idiocy. It would have been almost funny if it wasn't so dangerous. Because the float's undercarriage wasn't some steel husk. It was packed with delicate hydraulics, wiring rigs, and structural supports carefully balanced for the parade's complicated movements. One wrong move, one jammed component, and the entire frame could collapse like a house of cards. My hands curled into fists as I watched Karen dump an entire Starbucks cup of something sticky made of frappuccino across the exposed motor housing. She stood back, admiring her work with a twisted little smirk like a kid smashing sandcastles, then strutted back toward her golf cart without a hint of remorse. I let the cameras record everything. Wide shots, close-ups, perfect timestamps. When she sped away, kicking up another cloud of dust, I sat back and let out a long, slow breath. Karen had just crossed the Rubicon. This wasn't a warning anymore. This was vandalism. This was criminal sabotage of state-protected property. I didn't waste a second. Within minutes, the footage was backed up to 3 separate USB drives. A copy was uploaded to the cloud, and another was emailed directly to Mike Thornath, grizzled former cop now head of security for the governor's parade committee. When Mike called me 5 minutes later, his voice was ice cold. "Sit tight," he said. "We're gonna make sure she hangs herself with this one." And as I lay back in bed, heart still pounding but mind razor sharp, I realized something. Karen thought she had just delivered the killing blow. In reality, she had just fired the opening shot in a war she was utterly unprepared to fight. Tomorrow, Silverpine Ridge would start choosing sides. And Karen's clipboard army was about to crumble faster than she could whistle for backup. By dawn, there over Silverpine Ridge felt electric, like a storm was brewing just beyond the mountains. I stood at the edge of my workshop, surveying the damage under the rising sun. The float's frame had deep gouges across the hood, ugly brown smears across the sculpted panels, and worse, sticky residue gumming up the wiring for the hydraulic lift. If Karen had yanked even a single cable loose during her tantrum, the whole platform's rotation system could have been shot. The anger flared hot and fast in my gut, but I stamped it down. This wasn't a time for rage. This was a time for precision. I grabbed my phone and sent a single text to Mike Thorne: damage confirmed, evidence secured, requesting escalation protocol. Seconds later, my screen lit up with a single response. Green light. Document everything. Do not engage unless necessary. I spent the next 2 hours carefully photographing every scratch, every clump of mud, every footprint around the tractor. I logged timestamps, saved fresh security cam clips, collected fibers from where Karen's hoodie had snagged on my gatepost. By the time the sun fully crested the pine trees, my evidence folder was a prosecutor's dream. And Karen? Oh, she wasn't hiding in shame. Far from it. At precisely 8 o'clock a.m., the whole mailing list exploded with an email from Karen herself, subject line blaring in all caps. Victory for Silverpine Ridge Community ISO removed. She had attached grainy cell phone photos of the vandalized float, proudly framing them like war trophies. There she was, posing next to the mud-smeared frame like a hunter beside a downed elk, a triumphant grin splitting her sunburned face. Her message dripped with condescension, warning neighbors to report any further violations and praising herself for restoring neighborhood dignity. It would have been almost impressive if it hadn't been so colossally stupid. Because in her desperation to declare victory, Karen had just confessed to a felony in writing and broadcast it to every homeowner in Silverpine Ridge. Better yet, word leaked fast that she had started posting the same trash on her personal Facebook page. More pictures, more self-congratulations, more open admissions of her involvement. Neighbors forwarded screenshots to me before noon. Some of them, like Mrs. Lancaster, who always kept to herself, attached quiet notes like, "Just so you know, we don't all agree with her." Others, like old Captain Daniels, went further, offering to testify if it came to it. The tide was shifting, fast. I didn't need to lift a finger. Karen was building her own gallows, one smug post at a time. Meanwhile, I picked up the phone and made one more critical call to Dale Whitmore, a retired sheriff who lived down the ridge and now volunteered as a liaison for the governor's security detail. When I told Dale what had happened, he laughed so hard I had to pull the phone away from my ear. "You just sit tight, Wyatt," he wheezed. "We'll be ready when the fireworks start. You just keep that camera rolling, son." And I would. Because Karen wasn't done yet. No, she was about to make her boldest, dumbest move yet, and that would bring all of Silverpine Ridge to their porches with popcorn in hand. And this time, there would be no escaping the consequences. By mid-afternoon, the atmosphere around Silverpine Ridge felt like the thick, heavy air before a lightning strike. You could feel something big was about to happen. I was elbow-deep in rewiring the damaged hydraulic lifts when I heard the low, rumbling growl of a tow truck, far too loud, far too close. I wiped the sweat from my forehead and stepped out into the blistering sunlight. And there it was. Chugging up the gravel road toward my property came a battered, handed tow truck, its suspension creaking under the weight of its own incompetence. Painted in peeling letters on the door was quick and steady, towing a name that instantly felt like a lie. Behind it, riding in her golf cart like a queen overseeing an invasion, was Karen. Clipboard clutched to her chest, neon whistle bouncing furiously, her sunglasses perched like a crown atop her furious skull. I crossed my arms and leaned casually against the float's frame, heart pounding but face impassive. Let her make the first move. Let her dig herself deeper. The tow truck driver climbed out, clearly reluctant, squinting at the size of the float with obvious doubt. Karen marched straight up to him, jabbing her clipboard at the float like she was ordering an execution. "There it is," she barked. "Violation number 92. Remove it immediately under HOA code authority." The driver hesitated, looking between Karen, the float, and me, probably realizing too late that he was about to wade into something way over his pay grade. Karen shrieked again, stomping a sandaled foot like an angry child. "Do it. The driver, sweating bullets now, looped a rusted chain around the frame's axle and cranked his tow truck into gear. The truck's winch whined pitifully. The front wheels lifted off the ground for a terrifying moment before slamming back down with a shuddering crash. The audience, because, of course, neighbors had gathered, gasped, and then erupted into barely concealed laughter. Phones were out, cameras rolling. Across the street, Captain Daniels stood with his arms crossed, a wide grin under his white mustache. Karen's face twisted into something primal. She screamed at the driver, reached at me, hollered about bylaws and neighborhood rights. The driver tried again, repositioning his truck, but the tires spun uselessly, throwing dust into the air and shaking the float dangerously. One of the support welds groaned, a low metallic warning that made every muscle in my body tense. Enough. I stepped forward, voice sharp and clear enough to cut through the chaos. Touch that frame again, I said loudly enough for every phone microphone nearby to pick it up, and you'll be personally liable for damage to classified state property, a felony offense. Maximum penalties. Look it up. The driver froze mid-movement. Karen sputtered, whipping around to me, her mouth opening and closing like a fish gasping on dry land. State property, she hissed. This hunk of junk. Before I could answer, the distant rumble of SUVs echoed off the mountain slopes. All eyes turned to the bend in the road where a sleek line of black government vehicles rolled in, parting the crowd like Moses at the Red Sea. And out stepped none other than Governor Alan Prescott himself, sunglasses glinting, suit jacket crisp despite the heat, his expression unreadable. Karen stood frozen in place, her neon whistle dangling sadly against her clipboard as realization hit her like a freight train. This wasn't a neighborhood spat anymore. This was about to be a public execution politically, legally, and socially. And Karen had just delivered herself straight into the lion's den. The crowd parted like the Red Sea as Governor Prescott strode up the gravel drive, flanked by two stern-faced state security agents. Cameras swung to capture every step, microphones thrust forward by scrambling reporters, and phones everywhere pointed straight at Karen, who now stood stock still like a deer caught in a stadium spotlight. Prescott didn't waste a second. He marched straight up to me, extended his hand, and gave me a firm shake that sent murmurs rippling through the onlookers. "Wyatt McCall," he said, his voice carrying easily over the stunned crowd, "thank you for your hard work and perseverance under challenging circumstances." I nodded, saying nothing, while beside me Karen fidgeted, visibly wilting under the weight of a reality she had never even imagined in her worst whole nightmares. The governor turned slowly to face her, removing his sunglasses with a deliberate motion. Without them, his gaze was sharp enough to cut steel. "You," he said quietly, each word slicing the air, "have committed vandalism of classified state property." Karen opened her mouth to protest some desperate, trembling noise, but Prescott shut it down with a single raised hand. "You were warned. You ignored direct instructions. You engaged in unauthorized removal attempts. You vandalized a state-sponsored public event float dedicated to honoring first responders." The silence was so deep I could hear the buzz of a fly circling Karen's fanny pack. From the governor's side, uniformed sheriff stepped forward, pulling a pair of gleaming silver handcuffs from his belt. Karen's eyes went wide. No, wait. You don't understand," she shrieked, voice climbing into a panicked screech. "I'm the HOA chairwoman. I was protecting the community aesthetics. I have bylaws. I have rights." Prescott didn't even blink. "You have charges," he said flatly. At that, the sheriff seized Karen's wrists and spun her gently but firmly around. The click of the cuffs locking around her hands sounded like a gunshot in the hot, heavy air. The crowd gasped and a few actually cheered. Karen's head whipped around wildly as the reporters closed in, recording every second of her disgrace. Tears streamed down her face, smearing her foundation, but the sheriff was merciless. He recited her charges loud enough for every microphone to catch. Vandalism of state property, criminal trespass, obstruction of government operations. Karen tried to stumble back toward her golf cart, but the sheriff marched her straight toward the waiting patrol car. Brett and Pamela stood nearby, frozen in horror, their lattes dripping onto the gravel unnoticed. And just to make it perfect, as Karen was shoved gently into the back of the cruiser, a drone overhead zoomed in for a close-up live streaming the whole glorious downfall directly to half of Silverpine Ridge's Facebook feeds. Governor Prescott turned back to me as the patrol car door slammed shut. "Carry on, Mr. McCall," he said with the barest hint of a smile. "We're looking forward to seeing that float lead the Founders Day Parade." And just like that, the governor's motorcade pulled away, leaving the crowd buzzing like a kicked hornet's nest and Karen's legacy crumbling faster than wet sand in a flash flood. I stood there in the growing heat, the battered float behind me, the broken remnants of Karen's clipboard empire scattered across the gravel. Karen had gone all in on control, and she had lost. Spectacularly. But the real rebuilding real story was only just about to begin. The morning after Karen's very public downfall, Silverpine Ridge buzzed with a kind of electricity I hadn't seen in years. It was like the whole mountain had taken a deep breath, finally exhaling after being strangled by Karen's iron clipboard grip for far too long. Neighbors I hadn't spoken more than a few words to in years suddenly appeared at my gate, their faces cautious but hopeful. Some clutched toolboxes, others lugged paint cans, a few even brought coolers packed with sandwiches and sweet tea. At the head of the group stood Colonel Harlan Ellsworth, retired Air Force and the toughest old man on the ridge. His silver crew cut gleamed under the rising sun, and his weathered face cracked into a smile as he extended a hand. "Heard you might need a few extra hands," he said simply. For a long moment, I just stared. These were the same folks who had cowered under Karen's reign or had tiptoed through their lives, terrified of fines for untrimmed hedges or unauthorized porch shares. And now, here they were, standing shoulder to shoulder, ready to work, ready to rebuild, ready to fight for their home, and not against me, but against the fear Karen had planted. I smiled wide, feeling something heavy lift from my chest. "Only if you're ready to get your hands dirty," I said. The response was immediate. Colonel Ellsworth barked orders like it was a battlefield. Kids raced around with paintbrushes bigger than their heads. Retired mechanics dove under the float to check the suspension. Grandmothers wielded cleaning rags with the ferocity of a medieval army scrubbing away decades of dirt. Even Mr. Blevins Grump, who once threatened to sue over a misplaced garden gnome, showed up with a roll of duct tape and a surprisingly heartfelt, "Let's get it done, son." As the hours rolled by, Silverpine Ridge transformed. People laughed. They swapped stories. They made jokes about HOA citations and pink warning stickers. The float itself came back to life faster than I could have hoped. New panels gleamed under fresh paint. Wiring rigs were tightened and tested. The hydraulics hissed and groaned but eventually lifted the eagle statue proudly toward the sky again. Even as we worked, news trickled in from beyond our little mountain. Karen's arrest had gone virals, TikToks, even national news stories. Her shrieking about bylaws and beautification committees had been replayed so many times that even the kids could mimic her shrill protests perfectly. Word spread quickly. The Silverpine Ridge HOA board had held an emergency session and voted unanimously to suspend Karen indefinitely pending criminal proceedings. Rumor had it that several board members were already quietly drafting resignation letters, hoping to jump ship before the full legal backlash slammed into them like a runaway snowplow. The tide had turned. And it wasn't just about me. It wasn't even about the parade anymore. It was about something bigger. Silverpine Ridge had remembered what real community looked like. Not lawn inspections and citation threats. Not whispered fear and fake smiles. But neighbors long, building, sweating together under the sun, side by side. By sunset, when we finally set our tools down and admired the nearly completed float, I realized something. Karen hadn't just failed to destroy me. She had accidentally rebuilt an entire community stronger, louder, and prouder than it had been in decades. And this parade, it wasn't going to be just another event. It was going to be a victory lap for Silverpine Ridge itself. The next morning dawned cooler, a soft breeze rolling down from the mountains, almost as if Silverpine Ridge itself was sighing in relief. The float was nearly down its final weld set, the hydraulic arms tested and working, the rotating eagle sculpture gleaming under a fresh coat of gold paint. As I tightened the last bolts on the tribute platform, a battered blue pickup truck rumbled up the gravel drive. Mike Thorne, the grizzled ex-cop from the State Parade Committee, climbed out, waving a manila envelope above his head like he was delivering a presidential pardon. "Got something for you, McCall," he said, grinning like a fox who just found an unguarded henhouse. "It's from the governor himself." Curious, I wiped my hands and tore open the envelope. Inside was a crisp letter on official state letterhead. It authorized me to build a second float for the Founders Day Parade, a neighborhood heroes float. one designed to honor the real spirit of community resilience, and, in a subtle but pointed way, to mock the petty tyranny that nearly derailed everything. At the bottom of the letter, a handwritten note from Governor Prescott himself. Make it memorable. Silverpine Ridge deserves it. I stared at the paper, heart pounding, a slow smile spreading across my face. Oh, we were going to make it memorable. All right. By that afternoon, the whole community had rallied again. Colonel Ellsworth drew up a rough design, a giant, cartoonish oversized clipboard broken into crushed under a massive boot labeled Silverpine Neighbors United. Kids painted colorful banners reading Community Over Control and Real Neighbors Build, Not Break. Retired engineers rigged up speakers to play upbeat, playful music. Artists from the local elementary school painted murals of laughing neighbors planting gardens, fixing fences, sharing lemonade. The second float came together like magic. It wasn't just a float. It was a living, rolling middle finger to everything Karen had stood for and a celebration of everything she had failed to destroy. The energy around the project was electric. People who had barely nodded to each other for years were now working shoulder to shoulder, laughing, joking, ribbing each other good-naturedly about painting skills and hammer swings. Even Mrs. Carmichael, the sharp-tongued widow who once fined a neighbor for unsightly Halloween decorations, showed up with 24 homemade pies for the workers. By nightfall, under the glow of floodlights and the occasional crackle of fireworks being tested for the parade finale, both floats gleamed proudly in the clearing behind my workshop. One solemn, powerful tribute to first responders. The other hilarious, joyous declaration of community spirit overcoming petty tyranny. As I stood back, arms crossed, dust and paint still clinging to my jeans, I realized something beautiful. Karen had tried to tear this place apart. Instead, she had accidentally reminded everyone what real neighbors looked like. We weren't just ready for the parade. We were about to show the whole state what Silverpine Ridge was made of. And as for Karen, she wouldn't just be watching from the sidelines. She would become a permanent punchline in the greatest comeback story Silverpine Ridge had ever seen. Parade day broke over Silverpine Ridge with a sky so brilliantly blue it looked painted on, and the air was crisp, full of the smell of fresh-cut grass, barbecues firing up, ants and screens slathered onto kids squealing with excitement. From the moment I swung open the barn doors, I knew this wasn't going to be a normal parade. Already, crowds lined both sides of the winding mountain road, folding chairs crammed together, flags waving. Kids waving homemade signs that said things like "Heroes of Silverpine" and "Neighbors Not Dictators." The floats sat ready in the early sunlight, gleaming. The tribute float was perfect. The hydraulic eagle sculpture rose majestically, rotating in slow, dramatic sweeps as patriotic music drifted from hidden speakers. Behind it, the second float Neighborhood Heroes float stood proudly with its massive, broken clipboard sculpture and cheeky banners fluttering in the breeze. At 9 o'clock sharp, the governor's motorcade arrived. Governor Prescott, wearing a perfectly pressed navy suit and a wide grin, walked straight over to me and clapped me on the back hard enough to rattle my teeth. "You ready to make history, McCall?" he said, loud enough for the nearby cameras to catch. "You bet," I said, grinning. I climbed into the seat behind the tractor wheel, fired up the engine, and felt it rumble beneath me like a warhorse chomping at the bit. As the parade marshal dropped the green flag, we rolled forward, leading the parade straight down Main Street. The cheers hit like a wall of sound. Flags waved. Veterans saluted. Children danced around waving little sparklers. The tribute float shined like a beacon. The eagle sculpture glinted gold and silver. The hydraulics unfolded the panels of first responder murals flawlessly. And the speakers boomed with anthems that made even the toughest old-timers wipe at their eyes. And then came the second float. The laughter started as a ripple, then a roar. People doubled over with delight at the sight of the cartoonishly massive broken clipboard crushed under a boot, the banners reading "Community Over Control" whipping like battle flags. Kids on the float tossed candy into the crowd, while volunteers waved, laughing and dancing. Everywhere I looked at smiling faces, real smiles. Neighbors who had once only exchanged awkward nods now clapping each other on the back, high-fiving, snapping photos. And then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw her. Karen, trying to hide behind a pair of enormous sunglasses and a wide-brimmed hat, pressed up against the news vans like she could melt into the pavement if she stayed still enough. But it was no use. Silverpine Ridge had long memories and longer camera lenses. A little boy standing at the curb pointed straight at her and yelled loud enough for half the town to hear. "Hey, that's the lady who tried to ruin the parade." Every head within 20 feet snapped toward Karen. A tidal wave of snickers, giggles, and even a few outright cheers rolled through the crowd. Cameras swung toward her. Phones lifted in unison. Karen turned a brilliant shade of purple, yanked her hat lower, and tried to slink away, but it was far, far too late. In an instant, she wasn't the queen of Silverpine Ridge anymore. She was the punchline, immortalized forever in memes, in TikToks, in Facebook posts from laughing neighbors. The floats rolled on. The parade rolled on. And Karen, she got smaller and smaller and smaller until she finally disappeared altogether, swallowed by the very community she had once tried to rule with an iron clipboard. By the time we reached the end of the route at the city park, people flooded around the floats, taking photos, shaking hands, laughing. I lost count of how many folks clapped me on the back, handed me beers, hugged my volunteers. Later, on the main stage, Governor Prescott gave a short, fiery speech about resilience, about true community, and about the spirit that no clipboard or citation letter could ever defeat. And when he presented Silverpine Ridge with the first ever Community Spirit Award, naming us a model for the entire state, there wasn't a dry or a still camera in the entire park. Silverpine Ridge had risen from the ashes of petty tyranny. And Karen, she had become nothing more than a cautionary tally and a punchline we'd be laughing about for years to come. The fireworks that night turned the mountain sky into a roaring canvas of gold, silver, and red. Families sprawled on picnic blankets across the park field, kids chased each other with glow sticks, and the scent of grilled burgers and sweet kettle corn hung heavy in the cool summer air. I stood at the edge of the field, leaning against the hood of my truck, staring up at the night sky as the last float we had built together stood proudly under floodlights nearby. It wasn't just a hunk of wood and steel anymore. It was a symbol, a monument to what we had survived, and what we had reclaimed. All around me, Silverpine Ridge had transformed. Where there had once been whispered fear about HOA fines, now there were jokes and laughter. Where neighbors had once avoided eye contact for fear of becoming Karen's next target, now they were swapping phone numbers, planning block parties, talking about repainting the old community center together. We hadn't just built floats. We had rebuilt trust. We had remembered how to be neighbors again. The official ceremony earlier that evening had sealed it all. The governor had stood on the main stage, flanked by local officials, and unveiled a gleaming bronze plaque that would be installed at the town square, in honor of the citizens of Silverpine Ridge, whose courage, spirit, and unity shone brightest when challenged by pettiness and fear. May their example remind us all true community cannot be dictated, it is built. When my name was called to accept the certificate on behalf of everyone who had worked on the floats, the crowd's cheers had been deafening. Strangers shook my hand, hugged me, clapped me on the back. Even Tony, former HOA president who had once looked the other way while Karen ran wild, stood in the back of the crowd, tears in his eyes, nodding silently. Karen's name was never mentioned. It didn't need to be. Her story had already faded into legend. Somewhere, no doubt, she was watching all of this unfold from behind closed blinds, praying she would somehow become invisible again. But even that wasn't revenge enough. Because the real punishment for people like Karen isn't being screamed at. It's being forgotten. And Silverpine Ridge was moving forward without her, stronger than ever. I took a long sip of lemonade, watching the final burst of fireworks fade into trails of sparkling silver, and smiled to myself. This wasn't the end of anything. It was just the beginning. The beginning of a community that built, not broke. A neighborhood where kids played in front yards without fear of a clipboard. Where veterans sat swapping stories over barbecue instead of worrying about lawn height violations. Where laughter rang out louder than any whistle or citation ever could. And deep down, I knew, as long as we remembered what brought us Haralauder, stubbornness, pride, and a hell of a lot of hard work, no one like Karen would ever rule us again. Silverpine Ridge had chosen its future, and it was bright enough to light up the whole mountain. True community cannot be built on fear, control, or petty power. It grows through trust, resilience, and the willingness to stand together. In Silverpine Ridge, neighbors who had once been isolated by fear of rules and punishments found their real strength only when they chose unity over compliance, laughter over intimidation, and kindness over control. Karen's downfall teaches a timeless truth. Those who try to rule through fear eventually destroy themselves, because real leadership isn't about wielding authority, it's about inspiring respect. And when people remember how to be neighbors, not just residents, they create something far stronger than any rulebook or clipboard could ever command: a genuine, thriving community. In the end, it's not the loudest voice or the tightest grip that defines a place, it's the everyday acts of courage, kindness, and shared purpose that shape the future.